we're going to go to James Dorsey. Really been looking forward to this segment. James Dorsey, senior correspondent with Inside Arabia. Hey, if you want the real scoop on what's going on in the Middle East, you got a lot of choices out there. A lot of it's fake news. You want to get to the number one source for covering the Middle East like we do, the Gulf, North Africa. Where do you go? Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com. Bookmark it. First thing I do when I get up, I go to InsideArabia.com. See what's going on there because I get the best analysis. I get the best insight. I get the best reporting. I get no nonsense. I know it's not influenced by outside money forces. I know the writers, they're top drawer. That's why I go to InsideArabia.com. They're based right in Washington, D.C. Great organization. Great site for news and information on Gulf, Middle East, and North Africa. Joining us now live from Singapore, senior correspondent, InsideArabia.com. Go to InsideArabia.com, is James Dorsey, one of the most noted international writers on this side of the Milky Way. James, great to have you back, man.
John, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Look forward to this.
Okay, so, this is why I love James Dorsey, right? I just got to tell you this, show you the love here. This is why I love him. So for 2 days, we're talking about Bahrain, we're talking about UAE, but today, James writes the piece, and you can find that at InsideArabia.com. And the piece says, will they or won't they? Saudi recognition of Israel is the $64,000 question, the elephant in the room that nobody really wants to talk about. So, James, I'm going to give you the floor. Will the Saudis formalize relations with Israel or not? What's the deal? UAE just did, and everybody knows it. As NBC goes, MBS goes, although he's under pressure with some of the conservative clerics there. But that's the coup de grace. What's going to happen?
Well, let me first disagree with you, if I may. It's not always that where MBZ goes, MBS goes. I don't think that they have a difference on the principle of normalization of relations with Israel. These are not peace agreements because there never was a war, nor a declaration of war. This is the establishment of diplomatic relations. It was a lot easier for the UAE to do this. First of all, it's had far longer, more intensive contact with Israel, going back to the 1980s. Mm-hmm. This didn't happen just yesterday. Granted, the Saudis have also had long-standing contacts, but not quite as close as those that the UAE maintained. Mm-hmm. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Saudis, of course, are or position themselves as a leader of the Muslim world. So these kinds of decisions are far more difficult for them than they are for the UAE. And finally, in both countries, Palestine is a major foreign policy concern in the public eye. And when you look at polling among both Emiratis and Saudis, Palestine figures very prominently. The UAE is a much smaller population, also a much more easy population to control in a sense. The MBS has clearly decided he needs more time. And so what he's done in lieu, if you wish, of formally recognizing Israel, he's made a whole set of gestures. One was Bahrain. Bahrain cannot take a decision like this without Saudi consent. Mm-hmm. A second gesture was the publication of a think tank report in Riyadh that's very close to the Crown Prince, that came out with a report on praising the Crown Prince's stewardship, if you wish, of the modernization of religious education in the kingdom, so that it wouldn't have extremist narratives and would be reflecting more moderate concepts of Islam. The third thing he did is have the imam of the most important mosque in the world, the Grand Mosque in the holy city of Mecca, describe the Prophet Muhammad's relations with the Jews and how he had made peace with the Jews. And the fourth thing he did was open Saudi airspace to Israeli commercial airliners. So he was basically saying, look, we don't have an issue with normalization. We're gesturing that we're friendly towards Israel, we're friendly towards the Jews, but we're not going to recognize right now. It's going to take time.
And define taking time. Like what stands in the way? Because the way you've outlined this, James Dorsey, is rather in depth. I mean, all of the gestures by the Saudis and Mohammed bin Salman, all of the gestures made lend itself towards normalizing relations with Israel in a formal public format, the way UAE and Bahrain has done. And of course, as you said, Bahrain would not have been able to do that without MBS's tacit approval. So everything is there, but what stands in the way? What are the obstacles now?
Well, the most important obstacle is there's no solution to the Palestinian problem.
Right.
And I think you've got to be careful. Diplomatic relations with the UAE and Bahrain does not mean that the Palestinian problem disappears, nor does it mean that it disappears from the agenda of both the Emiratis and the Bahrainis.
Right.
So the Palestinian problem is very much there. Whether or not you get a change of policy if and when Mohammed bin Salman becomes king, that remains to be seen and is possible. I mean, fact of the matter is that the Palestinians, when they say that they're being betrayed, they're saying that because they feel that they've lost a trump card. The trump card being that the Arabs would only recognize Israel once there was a solution to the Palestinian problem. What the Palestinians don't recognize is that trump card has been on the table for 20 years at least, or roughly 20 years, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't persuaded Israel to change its policies towards the Palestinians. So it was a trump card that was imaginary. It wasn't worth anything. Now, the opposite is also not true. With other words, the fact that you can get a change of Israeli policy as a matter of principle through recognition isn't going to happen either. Israel will not change its policies because of the recognition of Arab states. The only thing it does is it limits to a certain degree what Israel can and cannot do. And what the recognition has done for all practical purposes, at least for a significant period of time, it's taken annexation of parts of the West Bank off the table.
John Fredericks Radio Network, Trucking the Truth Across America. We're with James Dorsey. James is a senior correspondent with Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com, my source for honest, in-depth analysis, news and information, Middle East, Gulf, and North Africa, which, as you know, I cover in depth because that gives you the telltale sign to everything else that goes on is in the Middle East. So this normalization, they call it a peace accord, the Abraham Accords, as you pointed out, James, really is not a peace, a normalization of relations formally. How does this move forward the peace agenda with the Palestinians? Like if you go back or forward, how does this influence it? And what is the next step now for the Trump administration, assuming they continue on, which I think they will, and B, for the Saudis as it relates to the Palestinians?
Let me just say one thing about the term peace. There's a reason why these are being called peace agreements, and the reason is the U.S. election. Right. Peace agreement plays well with Trump's base. Right. Normalization with Israel is fine, but it's not what a certain part of the base really cares about. It's peace.
Right. Right.
And that's why it's being used. What this has done, this is not an opening towards a solution with the Palestinians. What it has done is it's put, if you wish, the potential for a peace process on life support in the fear that it otherwise would have died with an Israeli move towards annexation. So, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has suspended formally the annexation. De facto, he's canceled it. And that's what keeps the process on life support. It's going to take a lot more for an opening to be created for a real peace process. And that's not going to be the Trump peace plan. There's nothing in that for the Palestinians. What you're going to get is certainly that the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and other Arab states that have informal contacts with Israel will presumably keep pounding on the Palestinian issue. Keep in mind that the first reason that the UAE officially gave for recognizing Israel was the Palestinian issue. With other words, that was a reflection of what public sentiment in the UAE is, and sentiment also in the government itself. I think it's wrong to assume that the Emiratis really don't care. They do care. Mm-hmm. They just think there's a different way of approaching this. Mm-hmm. If you get, and there is a likelihood for that, if you get social unrest on the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, that's going to expose the Israelis to pressure. Now, if a Biden administration comes to office, there's certainly going to be more pressure on Israel with regard to the way it handles those protests than under a Trump administration. But there's going to be pressure from the Arab states because they're going to be in a very difficult position if you see a hard-handed Israeli response to what essentially are peaceful demonstrations. And that would put Arab governments in a bind. So it's going to be those kind of issues that are going to have to nudge Israel towards and the Palestinians. I mean, the Palestinians are not innocent in the act or not are also partly guilty for the fact that you don't have a peace process. But it's going to be primarily the Israelis that somehow have to give an opening.
What would the opening be, James?
It's very tough. I mean, the lay of the land makes a two-state solution very difficult, just simply because if you go back to the negotiations there were land swaps involved. With other words, right. The Israelis were going to swap bits and pieces of the West Bank for bits and pieces of Israeli territory.
Right.
What the Israelis are looking at now under the Trump plan, the land swaps aren't possible. The reason that many want to keep the two-state solution alive, because the only other alternative is a one-state solution. And a one-state solution is either an apartheid state or not a Jewish state, mm-hmm. which is not a palatable solution for the Israelis, and wouldn't be a palatable solution, frankly, for parts of Trump's electoral base. The problem is that the Israelis, through the settlement policy, have created a situation that makes a two-state solution increasingly difficult.
Well, a lot of us that follow this really believe that the only way you're going to get lasting peace there is from a two-state solution. And so the territorial swap that had been proposed and leaked, everybody saw a couple of what those maps were many months ago. That's when I thought Kushner was. That's what I thought Kushner was working towards. Then when I got his plan finally leaked out, which was basically an economic buyout, as far as I can see. That was just never going to fly. It was just like they just wanted to buy the peace. I mean, you just can't do that. I mean, it really came at it from an odd way. I mean, the Palestinians are not going to take a payout and then just give up all chances of sovereignty. I never saw that as viable from my vantage point sitting here in the States. And the money was never there either. There was never any $50 billion. So the whole thing just kind of collapsed. But how do we get back to that? I mean, obviously, two things. A, how do we get back to that? And B, I want to get back to this Arab opinion index that was in your article that I thought was, I had to read it 3 times to be sure I internalized it. 80% of Saudis see Palestine as Arab rather than a purely Palestinian issue. So that means that if I'm an Arab, 80% of the Arabs in Saudi Arabia say to themselves, this is an Arab issue. This isn't a Palestinian issue. I mean, that's a huge number. I would have thought maybe it would be 55%. It's 80%, James. That's 8 out of 10 people in their population. That's a problem.
Well, I'm not sure it's a problem. Just one thing on the two-state solution. I'm a proponent of a two-state solution, and I've been suggesting that since the 1970s, when that was a heretic proposition that was not mainstream. I just think that it's become very difficult because it's going to be, if the Israelis were going to do what they did in Gaza, which is, we're going to hand it over to you, we're taking our settlers out, we're uprooting the whole thing, and we're going to move them and compensate them and resettle them in Israel. That option, just given the numbers, 650,000 people or whatever it is, that number is just impossible to do. Mm-hmm. And so the Israelis have created facts on the ground that, in terms of a two-state solution, are coming to haunt them. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that 80% figure that I cited of Saudis that feel that the Palestinian issue is an Arab issue is something that you would see replicated across the Middle East. In fact, if you go 2 years back, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy has done polling for the last 10 years, every year in the region. If you look at the polls of 2018 in the Emirates, Palestine was the number one foreign policy issue in terms of public concerns. Mm-hmm. So Saudi Arabia is not unique in this. What it means is that at the end of the day, even if Israel and Arab states have common interests, have reasons to work together on all kinds of issues, from security to technology, to whatever it may be, tourism, whatever it may be, the Palestinian issue is going to remain an issue. And that's what I think those numbers tell you.
Interesting analysis and interesting insight. I, too, share your view with a two-state solution, although the options for that seem to be narrowing every year that goes by and becoming tougher to do. Final question here before we're out of time. This normalization of relations accord that we're calling the peace accord, obviously for political reasons, I'll grant you that. Does this vindicate Jared Kushner?
Before I answer that, let me just throw you a thought on the two-state solution.
Okay.
If you go back to the 1970s, 1980s, there was a lot of analysis of the viability of a Palestinian state. And the final conclusion was it wasn't viable. But neither is Jordan economically viable. And so you needed to give the Palestinians their day in the sun. They needed to plant their flag. But ultimately, you were looking at whatever it would be, a confederation, a federation, an economic union, because that was the only way this was going to work, not only for the Palestinians, but long-term for the Jordanians, who don't have a viable, sustainable economy at the moment. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of Jared Kushner, I personally don't think it's a vindication. It was clear for me from day one that Jared Kushner was going to fail. He had started off on the wrong foot, and he never got off on the wrong foot. I think the most important thing on why this happened now is not Jared Kushner's success. It's the U.S. played an important role, but not necessarily in a sense a positive role. The two reasons are, one, people hedging their bets because they don't know what's going to happen in the November election, and hedging their bets because they don't know how the U.S. is going to, how committed the U.S. is going to remain to the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they need to make alternative arrangements. And I'm not sure that that's what Jared Kushner had in mind.
So he kind of got there, but maybe not the way that he had planned. But he got there nonetheless. So he's taken a lot of criticism. I'm as last defender in America, I think. John Fredericks Radio Network.